I think my mother did exactly the right thing. I think it's absolutely extraordinary.
Princess Anne believed the matter was finished. The recommendation had been reviewed, the estate papers prepared, and her final decision carried the confidence of someone who had spent years defending duty over sentiment. Then Charles intervened. Quietly. No public clash. No dramatic announcement. Just a royal veto that stopped Anne's decision before it could take effect. When she learned what her brother had done, her reaction was not surrender. It was defiance. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Anne had spent weeks working through the estate management decision, convinced that the old arrangements could no longer survive unchanged. Royal estates, meaning properties controlled or used by the royal household and family, were not simply homes. They carried status, access, influence, and the unspoken privilege of remaining close to the center of power. Her directive would have tightened those arrangements, limited special discretionary access for extended relatives, and tied future use more closely to active royal duty. She believed the principle was simple. Responsibility had to matter more than sentiment. Charles saw the danger differently. The king personally vetoed the directive before it could be implemented, ordering that the existing arrangements remain temporarily unchanged. A royal veto, in plain terms, meant the monarch was using final authority to stop a decision from taking effect. He believed the pause would prevent needless humiliation inside the family. Yet his sister heard something else in that decision. She heard a warning that personal loyalties could still overrule a process built around fairness. Anne read the handwritten instruction twice. Her expression hardened. She placed the paper flat on the desk and asked, "He overturned all of it?" The answer was yes. But one detail immediately unsettled her more than the veto itself. Charles had not challenged the logic behind the recommendation. He had not rejected the evidence, the transition plan, or the stricter working royal rules. He had stopped only the implementation. That meant the problem was not necessarily what she had decided. The problem was who would suffer when the decision became real. One estate now stood apart from the rest. Its continued use protected a member of the wider royal circle from a deeply embarrassing change in status, and Anne understood why her brother might hesitate. But understanding was not surrender. She requested the complete estate file, refused to withdraw her recommendation, and asked that evening for a private meeting with Charles without aides, intermediaries, or softened explanations. The veto had stopped Anne's decision, but it had also forced a far more dangerous question into the open. Who was Charles actually protecting? For decades, Charles and Anne had survived pressures few could understand. They had buried parents, watched scandals consume the family, and carried expectations that followed them throughout their lives. Yet this dispute was different. Anne was not challenging Charles's crown. She was challenging his judgment. And for the king, that distinction made the confrontation even more painful, because the person refusing to retreat was not a rival. She was his sister. Anne had always trusted work more than ceremony. Discipline, repetition, and responsibility shaped the way she understood royal service, meaning the public duties carried out on behalf of the monarch and country. To her, privilege only survived when matched by purpose. That was why the estate decision felt so personal. She did not see tighter rules as punishment. She saw them as proof that the family could demand from itself the same seriousness it expected from everyone else. Charles carried a different fear. The king had to protect efficiency, but he also knew how quickly private hurt could become scandal. One fractured relationship could dominate headlines, deepen old resentments, and make every future decision harder. After dinner, he reopened Anne's notes and read them. Her reasoning was careful. Her compromises were clear. That left him facing the possibility he did not want to name. Perhaps the veto had not been about policy at all. Perhaps it had been about emotion. Anne felt that possibility before anyone said it aloud. Speaking privately to a trusted aide, she admitted she could accept being overruled by constitutional necessity, meaning a decision required by the monarch's formal duties and powers. What she could not accept was having a decision reversed because enforcing it might embarrass someone. Her frustration sharpened when she learned her recommendations had already passed several internal administrative reviews. No senior office had formally rejected the plan. Charles had stopped it himself. The tension became unmistakable during a family encounter. Charles greeted his sister politely. Anne answered just as politely. Neither mentioned the estate file. Neither needed to. The careful words and refusal to acknowledge the dispute carried more hostility than an open argument ever could. He knew she was waiting for an explanation. She knew he was avoiding one. Then Anne found the detail that changed everything. The king had intervened only after receiving a private appeal connected to one of the affected properties. The timing made sense. The veto had not appeared from nowhere. It traced back to an old disagreement, one she had believed was finished months earlier. To understand why Charles stopped his sister at the final moment, the story had to return to the conversation that quietly made this confrontation inevitable. The real fracture had begun months earlier, not inside a council chamber, but after a private family dinner. No announcement followed. No statement escaped the palace, yet one conversation that evening transformed an ordinary dispute over property into a battle over authority. Anne spoke plainly. Charles tried to soften the consequences, and one affected relative made an emotional appeal that neither sibling forgot. By the time the estate veto arrived, the argument had already been waiting to explode. Anne had raised the issue without drama. At a private dinner at Windsor, the royal residence review came up naturally, and she stated that one long-standing arrangement should end when the current review expired. A royal residence, in this context, meant a property used by members of the family under arrangements connected to the crown rather than ordinary private ownership. Her reasoning was practical. Fewer working royals meant fewer homes could remain protected simply because changing them would be uncomfortable. Charles reacted carefully. The king warned that pushing occupancy changes too aggressively could make relatives feel cast out at a time when the monarchy was already carrying old fractures. To him, stability mattered because one family grievance could quickly become a public crisis. Anne heard the argument and refused to bend. She told him that avoiding hard decisions in the name of peace did not remove the problem, it only delayed it. Charles heard more than policy in those words. He heard judgment on the way he was leading. The tension deepened after dinner. The affected family member approached Charles privately and described Anne's proposed restrictions as humiliating rather than administrative. He listened, said little, and promised only that he would look carefully before anything became final. That conversation mattered because Anne never knew it had happened. She continued the formal review, believing her brother had accepted the principle behind the reforms, even if he disliked the consequences. Anne would understand the truth only later. When she examined the timing of the veto, the sequence became impossible to ignore. Renewed pressure from the same family connection had reached Charles shortly before he stopped her directive. The decision that once looked sudden now had a history. And worse, it had a private emotional thread running through it. Anne closed the old briefing folder and remembered the silence across that dinner table. In that moment, everything changed. Charles's hesitation had never disappeared. It had simply been waiting for the final decision to become real. Armed with that realization, Anne entered the private meeting, no longer seeking an explanation. She wanted Charles to admit why he had intervened. The next conversation would not be about paperwork at all. It would be about whether family loyalty had crossed the line into royal weakness. Anne did not raise her voice. That made the confrontation worse. Charles had expected resistance, perhaps frustration, even anger. What he faced instead was his sister sitting opposite him with the vetoed estate file between them and refusing every diplomatic escape. She did not accuse him of betrayal. She did something harder. She asked him to explain the decision plainly. And when Charles tried to speak about family consequences, Anne pushed the question directly back at him. Anne placed the estate directive on the table and kept her eyes on her brother. "You stopped it. Then tell me which part was wrong." Charles did not answer immediately. A veto, meaning the monarch's formal power to prevent a decision from taking effect, gave him the authority to halt her recommendation. But authority was no longer the point. She wanted the reasoning. He finally said the reforms themselves were not being rejected, only reconsidered, because the timing and human consequences had become too serious to ignore. Charles tried to keep the discussion measured. The king argued that changing long-standing arrangements could wound people who already felt increasingly distant from royal life. Anne answered that discomfort did not automatically make a decision unjust. She reminded him that her proposal included transition periods and alternatives. A final decision, she said, could not remain final, only until someone close enough to the monarch complained privately. He heard the accusation inside the sentence, even though she never raised her tone. Anne then made the conflict personal. She told Charles she would have accepted disagreement months earlier. She would even have accepted being overruled from the beginning. What she could not accept was being allowed to carry the review through every stage, defend its consequences, and then discover at the end that her judgment could be undone by a private appeal. He admitted that he had received such a plea concerning the residence. He insisted it had not dictated his decision. She did not look convinced. The silence became the sharpest moment of all. Anne asked one final question. Would Charles have vetoed the directive if that conversation had never happened? He hesitated. Just long enough. The answer was suddenly everywhere between them, and neither sibling could pretend otherwise. Charles reached toward the file. Anne kept one hand resting on it for a second longer before letting go. She had lost the immediate decision, but not the argument behind it. Now she wanted the palace to define where constitutional authority ended and personal discretion began. Anne had turned away from one residence and toward the machinery behind it, and what she found there would make the dispute far larger than either sibling intended. Charles had the authority to stop the decision. That was never the mystery. The real danger lay in what exercising that authority revealed. Inside the royal household, the veto forced senior officials to confront an uncomfortable divide between formal power and trusted responsibility. Anne had been asked to make a difficult recommendation. She had made it. Then the king had stepped in. Now every person involved had to decide whether the process still meant what they thought it meant. Charles understood the structure better than anyone. As monarch, he held final authority over arrangements that remained under the crown, meaning decisions connected to royal property could be advised upon and reshaped by others, but could not ultimately override him. Anne had never disputed that power. What troubled her was how it had been used. She had been trusted with the review because she was known for making hard choices without chasing approval, and now that very independence seemed to have become the problem. William saw the danger almost immediately. The prince received a confidential summary of the dispute, a restricted internal briefing intended only for senior members of the household, and read it carefully. He was less interested in whether his father technically had the right to veto Anne than in what came next. If difficult recommendations could be reversed once they became emotionally uncomfortable, why would anyone accept responsibility for making them in the first place? Charles felt the pressure closing in. He believed the veto was being treated as evidence of weakness when, in his mind, he had been trying to prevent a family decision from becoming unnecessarily brutal. The king knew that homes inside royal life carried more than practical value. They represented belonging, rank, memory, and proximity to the center. Yet the more he defended compassion, the more others began wondering whether compassion had become an excuse for special treatment. Anne refused to exploit that suspicion. She told her staff there would be no leaks, no private campaign, and no attempt to embarrass her brother. But she also made one thing clear. She would not rewrite her original reasoning simply to make his veto easier to justify. Her position remained exactly where it had been before the confrontation. Then William found the detail that shifted the balance. Anne's proposal had never demanded an immediate removal. It included a transition period and an alternative arrangement designed to reduce disruption. He read that clause twice, closed the file, and said quietly, "Hard, but hardly cruel." Charles soon heard about the remark. In that instant, the king understood the dispute had crossed another line. This was no longer only a brother and sister clashing over judgment. What began as Charles versus Anne was becoming something more dangerous, a test of whether the future king believed the present one had made the wrong call. No palace announcement revealed the damage. It appeared instead in smaller moments. Invitations were reconsidered. Meetings became shorter. Conversations stopped when certain people entered rooms. Charles had prevented one family rupture, yet his veto was creating another. Anne remained outwardly composed, but those closest to her noticed the difference immediately. She had stopped arguing about the estate. That silence did not mean she had surrendered. It meant the argument had moved somewhere deeper. Anne received confirmation during a working lunch. The estate arrangement would remain unchanged while Charles ordered a fresh review, effectively freezing her directive and leaving the disputed residence under its existing terms. A fresh review, in plain language, meant the decision would be examined again before any final change was allowed. She folded the note once, set it beside her plate, and continued the meeting as though nothing had happened. Only after everyone left did the restraint finally crack. Anne admitted to a trusted family member that losing the decision was not what hurt most. She could accept defeat. What she struggled to accept was being trusted with responsibility, asked to make a hard judgment, and then treated as though conviction itself had become inconvenient once the consequences arrived. Her anger had cooled into something heavier, disappointment, and that was far harder for Charles to dismiss. Charles soon heard that his sister had withdrawn from voluntarily advising on another estate matter. The king understood the message immediately. She would continue performing every duty required of her, but she would no longer lend her name to a process she did not trust. For him, that was the first real cost of the veto. He had preserved one arrangement, but he was beginning to lose Anne's confidence. William watched the fracture carefully. The prince refused to take sides in public because any visible disagreement with his father could transform a private dispute into a story about succession and royal unity. Yet privately, he asked to see Anne's complete original proposal rather than the shortened summary circulated after the veto. What he found unsettled him. William read handwritten comments showing that Anne had repeatedly adjusted the plan to reduce disruption. She had softened deadlines, expanded transition options, and protected dignity wherever possible. The image of an uncompromising decision-maker suddenly looked incomplete. Her proposal had been firm, but it had not been without compassion. Charles felt that truth before anyone confronted him with it. At an informal family discussion, he noticed Anne's empty chair where she would normally have been. For the first time, the king seemed genuinely unsettled by what his victory had cost. William decided silence was no longer preserving peace. He asked Anne for a private conversation without Charles, staff, or advisors. The turning point would come not through another royal directive, but through two people speaking alone about what duty should look like after Charles's decision. William did not ask Anne to challenge Charles. He asked something more personal. Had the veto changed how she saw the monarchy she had spent her life serving? For the first time since the dispute began, Anne allowed the anger to fall away. She spoke not as the king's sister, not as a senior royal, but as someone who feared that avoiding pain had become more important than making difficult decisions. William listened, and then made a choice neither expected. William met her alone. No aides waited nearby, and no estate papers sat between them at first. The prince asked whether she intended to withdraw permanently from future property reviews, meaning formal examinations of how royal homes and estates should be managed. Anne answered without hesitation. She would never abandon duty. But duty, she said, could not mean giving honest judgment only when that judgment caused nobody discomfort. If difficult advice was welcomed only until it became painful, then the process itself had become hollow. Anne listened as William defended one part of his father's thinking. He understood why Charles feared another family fracture. The monarchy had already endured departures, public disputes, and wounds that had taken years to settle. A home could become more than bricks and land. Inside royal life, it could represent rank, belonging, and closeness to the sovereign. She accepted that symbolism, but argued that the family had created the problem by allowing residences to become measures of personal worth. William then told her what changed everything. He had read the full proposal, including every transition arrangement and every attempt to reduce hardship. The future king did not believe her decision had been reckless, punitive, or cold. He would not publicly oppose Charles because turning the disagreement into a father and son confrontation could damage the institution further. But he intended to recommend that the renewed review use Anne's original criteria instead of beginning again from nothing. Anne remained silent for several seconds. Then she brought forward the original estate folder and slid it toward William. "Then read all of it, not the version people are comfortable with." He accepted it without argument. In that moment, her objective changed. She no longer needed Charles to suffer a public reversal. She wanted something stronger, a transparent rule that could not be quietly bent depending on who complained. William understood the distinction. Anne was no longer fighting to defeat her brother. She was fighting to make sure the same conflict could not happen again. But before Charles could settle the matter privately, fragments of the dispute escaped the palace. By the next morning, the argument Charles had tried to contain inside the family belonged to everyone. The private language of estate reviews disappeared overnight. The public version was brutally simple. Charles had overruled Anne, and Anne had refused to retreat. Newspapers turned administrative disagreement into sibling warfare. Broadcasters debated whether the Princess Royal had exposed weakness at the heart of the monarchy. Yet inside the palace, both understood something the headlines missed. Neither wanted the other defeated. The real battle was now over whether they could resolve the issue without appearing to surrender. Anne saw the argument transformed before breakfast. One newspaper carried the words, "Anne stands firm," across its front page, with a smaller line declaring that the king had halted her royal estate decision. The Princess Royal, a title traditionally given to the monarch's eldest daughter, had suddenly become the public face of resistance. Outside Buckingham Palace, a modest crowd gathered near the gates, while television crews described the dispute as a clash between her reputation for discipline and Charles's instinct to protect family relationships. Charles watched the coverage with growing discomfort. A broadcaster described the king as caught between compassion and control, and he switched off the television before the segment finished. He knew why the phrase hurt. Some commentators praised him for remembering that royal relatives were human beings, while others argued Anne's stricter approach better reflected the smaller, more accountable monarchy the institution had promised. What had been a family disagreement was now being judged as a test of leadership. Anne disliked the role the public had assigned her. She had never intended to become a symbol of rebellion, and she had no desire to weaken her brother's position. Her challenge was to his decision, not his right to reign. That distinction mattered deeply to her, because winning public applause at Charles's expense would turn principle into personal humiliation. She wanted reform, not revenge. William understood how quickly that distinction could disappear. The prince warned both that prolonged silence would allow people to invent motives far uglier than the truth. If the palace said nothing, the dispute could be recast as a succession struggle, a family rebellion, or evidence that the monarch had lost control. He urged them to resolve the policy before the story hardened around them. Charles finally accepted what the veto had failed to achieve. Keeping it in place would not end the controversy. The monarchy needed a clear estate principle that could survive beyond any one ruler. He asked Anne to meet again, this time not to defend his first decision, but to settle the final policy together. Anne agreed. Her condition was simple. The new rule had to apply equally, even when equality hurt. For the first time since the veto, Charles and Anne returned to the same table not as victor and defeated, but as two siblings forced to decide what mattered more than winning. The final meeting ended very differently from the first. There was no demand that Charles withdraw his veto. Anne no longer needed one, and the king no longer tried to pretend his intervention had carried no cost. What emerged instead was something harder than victory: compromise with consequences. Charles preserved his authority. Anne preserved the principle behind her decision. And between them, a family argument over royal property became a defining lesson about duty, compassion, and power. Charles spoke first. The original veto would remain, which meant Anne's specific directive would not be restored exactly as she had issued it. But the king then approved a permanent estate framework, built substantially around her original principles. The framework, meaning the lasting rules governing how royal residences would be reviewed and allocated, required regular occupancy reviews, clear transition periods, a demonstrable purpose for continued use, and equal treatment when comparable family arrangements came under scrutiny. Anne listened without interrupting. She had lost the order itself, but the reasoning behind it had survived. Anne understood what the compromise meant for the disputed residents. The family member involved would not face an abrupt removal, yet the arrangement would no longer continue indefinitely simply because changing it was uncomfortable. A defined transition period would protect dignity while eventually bringing the property under the same standards applied elsewhere. Charles could preserve compassion without creating a permanent exception. For the first time, the king was accepting that mercy became dangerous when it quietly transformed into privilege. Charles also understood what his sister had forced him to confront. She had never demanded public humiliation. She had never leaked their disagreement or tried to turn William against him. Anne's defiance had been harder than rebellion because she had remained loyal while refusing to abandon the principle she believed mattered. Before leaving, she told her brother plainly that she had never wanted his crown challenged. He answered that he knew. Then he admitted something deeper. That was exactly why her opposition had carried so much weight. William later received the final framework and recognized immediately that the settlement reached beyond one residence. The future king saw a monarchy choosing rules over improvisation while still leaving room for humane transitions. Charles's veto had survived. Anne's principle had survived too. Neither sibling emerged untouched, but neither had been defeated. Anne walked away without the decision she first demanded, but with something more lasting, a rule that would remain after the anger faded. Charles kept his authority, yet accepted its limits. The monarchy was strongest not when nobody challenged the king, but when duty survived the challenge. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.